Testing, testing. Hi, everybody. It's about 5 minutes early, but it seems like the room is pretty much full. So who votes for starting early? Okay, we have to wait for the recording guy to get all the recordings going. You ready? Okay, I'm going to start early. There's nothing terribly important in the first 5 minutes if somebody wants to come in later. Basically, today I wanted to talk about design methods. For me, these are basically kind of the way I approach design from a very tactical point of view. It's really a bunch of tips, tricks, methods that I use like a big grab bag. When I get stuck in a design problem, I just kind of start pulling things out of that bag almost at random and try applying them to the design process. I think there's been a lot of talk more recently in the last few years about how we can apply more formal design methods to games. I've never found one method, one monolithic approach that works. For me, it's always this diversity. How many people in this room are game designers? Oh, that's quite a few. That's the wrong answer, though. Everybody should raise their hand. I've had great evidence of that, actually. About 3 to 4 times a day, I get game designs that people send to me. Anybody who plays a game, is apparently a game designer. These game designs generally kind of look like this. Occasionally, I'll get one that's typed. But games are kind of funny in that way. I think people, games seem so apparent that anybody who plays a game thinks that they really kind of understand how to design a game. And I think, really, if you look at all the different design fields out there, game design is easily one of the hardest, not the easiest. And I think for that reason, it's kind of important that us as designers, as game designers, first, we have to learn to be good designers. I think that is like something that there's so many inspirations that we can pull from, so many other fields that we can learn good design practices and principles from that help you, in any form of design, but game design especially. A few years ago, I was talking about kind of other formal design methods, how to deconstruct any design task into a bunch of functional kind of requirements. Another way of looking at it was that you're actually traversing this design tree, basically of solution space. And it's a tree that starts out with very thick, broad branches, but eventually decomposes down to very fine, individual little tactical decisions. And the designer's working at every one of these levels. And it's really you navigating this tree that is kind of one of the ways I visualize the design process. So generally, I think of myself as kind of traversing this tree, making decisions at each level. What do I do next? What's the best way to go here in the design? Kind of working my way down this tree. Now, occasionally, you'll hit a roadblock and say, okay, I'm stuck here. What do I do? Frequently, I look at it as kind of backtracking. Sometimes it's because you took the wrong turn. And so you have to kind of work your way back up this design tree. And then you'll see a clearer path, something that kind of gets around the design obstacle. You get to continue. Basically, what we're doing is we're searching the solution space. There are all these possible designs that we could be doing, all these possible solutions to the design problems we encounter. We're going kind of from the general to the specific. We start with very general, decisions about what genre am I going to make, what are the graphics going to look like, and eventually, at the end of the day, we're down to is this button going to be red or blue? A lot of the pruning we actually do of that space, is I think through intuition. Some of you may be familiar with the idea of a mini-max tree that people use in chess. Chess-playing computers use this. They look ahead a certain number of moves, kind of assuming that you're making the best move and the opponent's making the best move. But they can only look ahead so far, so deep. At some point, they have to kind of give up that look-ahead strategy, and they have to apply what's known as an evaluation function. What that does is that looks at certain board features and just tries to guess, okay, is this a good position or not? Based upon things like center board control, how many pieces have I lost, et cetera. As a designer, I kind of feel like that's what we do with our intuition. So as we're going down this tree, a lot of the pruning that we're doing of this tree, at some point, we can't look ahead and imagine the next 5 levels of decisions deep. We're actually applying intuitive filters. Basically, our intuition is helping us prune and guide us down this tree and narrowing out kind of the design space or the solution space that we're exploring. One of the more interesting kind of design methods that's come up recently is the 400 project started by Hal Barwood and Noah Falstein. This is kind of inspired by Christopher Alexander's work in design patterns. They've basically been trying to collect nuggets of wisdom that they have on their webpage. And these are very useful, but you have to kind of realize that these are tools. And you have to use them appropriately as tools. I have a bunch of tools at home, and they've never jumped off the workbench and built a chair for me. Okay, so the thing about tools is you have to learn how to use them. With things like these design tools, in some situations, certain ones are far more relevant than others. And this is something that you just kind of learn through experience. In other situations, these rules will actively be fighting each other, contradicting each other. And it's kind of, you have to kind of learn, which one to believe, which one, to use. You can't cut a board in half with a drill press easily. You can't drill a hole with a bandsaw. So kind of learning which tool to use in what situation is kind of important. Another way that I approach games kind of in a very broad sense is, in some sense, you're creating a language. You're creating a language for your player. The player is going to understand your game in certain terms, certain abstractions. If you actually listen to player stories, the way they describe what happened to them. Oh, I was going down this level and I hit the boss, but I had the golden arrows and I got in the power-ups and then I defeated the boss and got to the next level. That's the language that you're teaching your players. It's the abstraction that they are coming to understand your game in terms of. There's also a language that designers use when we talk about designing a game. It's a very different language than the players use. And we're talking about things like feedback structures and the overall arc of the game, where the nested levels are. And so I think both of these things are kind of important to clarify as you're designing a game. What is the player's language? What is the designer's language? One of the first elements of that is really kind of what metaphors can you apply. I mean, this is a very quick, compressed way to kind of give a player a language or a way to understand your game. A lot of games have very obvious metaphors. The Sims is pretty obviously a dollhouse. A game like Quake is, basically cowboys and Indians, or Tag. Command & Conquer, feels like little toy tanks and soldiers. Some games have a little bit less obvious metaphors, but even then they're still useful. I always thought of Grim Fandango as kind of Casablanca on acid. It's one way that's kind of useful for figuring out what your language is in the game is to kind of watch players and the way they build things or the way they describe things. You can ask a person to draw an airplane or draw a boat and look at the order in which they draw it, and it will give you a good sense of their priorities on the nouns. If you ask a kid, draw a boat, and look at the order in which he actually constructs it, you're going to get a good sense of the hierarchy in his head of what a boat is. This is kind of, a filtering function in a sense. What are the highest priority nouns, the next highest priority, and so forth. This filtering function is actually something that happens at all levels of design. I'm sure most of you have been to E3, right? And you know what it's like. You go into E3 and it's just this cacophony of sights and sounds, and you feel like total sensory overload. You don't know what to do. You start applying these very hard filters, and you're maybe looking for a particular game or looking for something interesting, but it's an active struggle, to deal with that amount of information coming in. Pilots, they call this workload management. The same thing. They have massive amounts of information coming to them through the cockpit, and what do they listen to? What's the most relevant piece of information at a given time? Now, we're continually doing this with our game players. We're always throwing just vast amounts of information at them, and we're somehow magically expecting them to pull out the relevant little piece of information. What's the right button? What am I thinking about? And I think we do this, when you work on a design like this, of course, you totally forget how complex it is because you've been building it layer by layer by layer. But when all of a sudden you've never seen this and somebody puts a screen up like that, you are lost, So basically, in some sense, it's kind of like we're dealing with a SETI at home thing. There's this vast sea of information that we're presenting to the players, and we're expecting them to pick the signal out of it. There's actually an interesting book, at least the first half of this book I really liked. The second half got a little weird, called The User Illusion by Tor, and I won't even attempt to pronounce his last name, Tranders, something like that. But at any rate, he was analyzing, it's kind of modern cognitive psychology. One of the things he was looking at was the actual data that we receive from our senses, the actual bit rate that we're getting through our optic nerve and through our hearing, et cetera. And he roughly estimated that we're getting about 10 million bits a second of information through our optic nerve, through our visual system. About 1 million bits per second through our skin, through our tactile sense. About 100,000 bits per second through our sense of sound, about the same for smell, and about 1,000 bits per second for sense of taste. Now, that's a massive amount of information that's flowing into our brain every single second. What's interesting, if you analyze the stream of consciousness, actually you can very easily analyze the data rate of your stream of consciousness, and it works out to about 1/1,000,000th of the amount of data that's actually coming in through your senses. What's interesting about this is it kind of points out the fact that probably 98% of our intelligence is preconscious. What we call intuition or reflex or subconscious intelligence is not apparent to us. And it's a filtering function. We're getting data in all the time, every second, and our preconscious intelligence is filtering that data and deciding which little bits of that are relevant at any given time. And sometimes it's just really surprising. A kid runs out in front of your car, you grab, that goes right into your conscious level, you become aware of it, and you respond to it. So what we will need to do is we need to figure out, kind of how these mechanisms work. How do we make sure that we get the right information to the player through these filters at the right time? Imagine you're walking down the street, and all of a sudden you come across this. Maybe it's growling at you. In an instant, in a microsecond, you are going to parse this situation. You are going to apply some high level of abstraction to this. One way of looking at this is, decomposing it, kind of back into a language of nouns, verbs, and adjectives. Now, you might even take this and, think about yourself. You basically are parsing the dog in this language, but you might also parse your own actions in this language. This is kind of one example of this vast amount of information going through these perceptual filters and turning into a high-level representation very quickly. And this happens to us all the time. There's another way of parsing it, where maybe we kind of look at what's the perceptual parsing. Maybe I'm doing a classification of this thing. From that, I might then, once I've classified it, I might say, okay, what actions are available to this noun? And then, how do I relate to that? What can I do, to affect the system? And maybe if it was a less stressful situation, I might even kind of go to a higher level, kind of, what are dogs useful for? Oh, I remember my old dog, Benny, that died, and so they can evoke kind of past memories. Now, when our players see a game, they do very much the same thing. You present them with information like this, and very quickly they're going to kind of pull out the nouns. It's actually kind of interesting. One trick that people have discovered in games is, if you'll notice, the things like the trees and bushes here are rendered in a slightly different style than like the tanks and buildings. They're a little less saturated, a little less delineated. That's a subtle hint to the player that they are not relevant nouns in the situation. So it's pretty apparent that the tanks and the buildings, can have actions and do things, but the trees and stuff are kind of, at most, secondary nouns, basically irrelevant to the situation. You can also look at this and kind of parse out the verbs. This is a very common verb in games. And even the adjectives. You can actually look at the differences in similar, classifications. And so when players first look at a game screen, this is one method they use for kind of parsing out all the information and coming to understand it. What's interesting is you can actually go to a game store and do the same thing. You can look at most games on a shelf and very easily classify them by what verb do they represent. That's about half the games. A few more. But almost every game can kind of be understood in terms of what's the primary verb that the player is kind of doing in the game. One thing that players do in games, in first-person shooters a lot, you go around and you shoot everything in sight and see what breaks. Sometimes crates blow up and you get cool things out of them. Other things blow up and just make cool explosions. Other things just kind of, nothing happens. And so players in that sense are using the verb of the game to discover the noun. If something breaks or blows up, then it's a relevant noun in the game. That object actually has some behavior and probably enters the gameplay. Whereas the things that you can't, really, destroy with your gun probably are irrelevant. They're like, level elements. One thing we discovered with The Sims pretty early on, we did a lot of playtesting. And we put people in front of The Sims that had never seen it before. And it was interesting. They would kind of go through the different modes, and they were kind of thrashing around, didn't know what to do. But very quickly, they would always fall onto the buy catalog, that has all the objects you can buy. And it was amazing how almost everybody fell into that fairly early on, and they stayed there. They would sit in the catalog and start browsing all the objects. And obviously, it was a point of comfort for them. They felt very comfortable, at their own pace, kind of browsing through the objects of the catalog. And this is, true of male and female. And we're trying to figure out why, we'd be sitting there getting really frustrated. Why don't you play the game? Why don't you play the game? Oh, just a second. I want to look at some more objects. It was only later that I kind of realized what was happening is I think that they were using our buy catalog as a tutorial for the language of the game. By browsing the different objects in the catalog, they got a sense of what are the nouns in the game. Once they understood the nouns, they inferred the verbs. So they see a toilet and they say, oh, it's a game where I get to pee. And they looked at the ratings of the objects, and they see that different chairs have different comfort ratings, and they realize that, oh, that adjective is actually kind of relevant to the gameplay. So in some sense, they were able to build a rough model of the data structure of The Sims just by browsing the catalog. And this is not unique to The Sims. In fact, I've seen this in almost every game. Almost every game I've seen, there's a shopping thing. It's either you creating a character, or you're buying an army, or you're applying some repair points. But I've found that the idea of shopping, of basically resource allocation, in a non-time constrained environment, is pretty much independent of gender, age, and culture. It's surprising. Everybody can relate to this. And so for me, whenever I look at a game now, one of the first things I say is, what is the player shopping for? Because I really think that I want to give the player a comfort point like that where they can kind of come in and learn the language of the game in a non-threatening way, without being shot at. They can sit there at their own pace and learn the language of the game. Also, I want to figure out how soon can I have the player in a shopping mode, because I think it's almost better than a tutorial. At their own pace, they can kind of come to understand what the game is made out of. Another way to kind of look at teaching your players your language, and this is a somewhat higher level construct, is the idea of landmarks. These are high level, kind of almost events or experiences you want the player to have in your game. A lot of people think in terms of, actually a lot of the old movies, what they used to do is they would build a poster for the movie before they shot the movie. And they would use the poster to explain to the producers or the financiers what the movie was going to be about. And you could look at the poster and say, oh, I see, there's going to be romance and plane crashes and scantily clad Native women or whatever. And they didn't really care what the plot was, but they just kind of understood that, this gives me a rough boundary, an envelope of, what this movie is going to be about. You can actually approach game design in the same way. I mean, I wouldn't exclusively recommend that as your only game design method. But let's say I wanted to do a game, and I love helicopters, so it's going to have cool attack helicopters. And I want to have massive Technicolor explosions. And I really like the architecture of Zurich, And I'm kind of environmentally aware, so I want to have global warming in there somewhere. Now I can kind of look at these elements and figure out, the very, very broad strokes. How do they connect? How might they relate? From that, I can start interpolating, inferring, the other game elements that would kind of connect these things. Now, again, I wouldn't recommend this as your only game design method, but it actually can produce some very interesting results. Who would have thought that you could combine Mexican Calaveras figures with Big Daddy Roth hot rods in Casablanca to get Grim Fandango? And I think, Grim Fandango is a good example of that, where he took these very strong cultural inspirations as landmarks and used them to help guide the process along the way. I want to talk a little bit now about working in a design team, which is something that I've been spending more and more time doing the last few years. The first game I did was 1984, and I was the programmer, designer, wrote the manual, did the art, the music, etc. That's the way games were done back in 1984. About 5 years later, I did SimCity, and there were about 5 people involved. One of them was like a part-time artist too, even. So that was kind of cool, having a dedicated artist. SimCity 2000, we did with a team of about 10 people, 1994. Then came The Sims in 2000. These are about 5-year time chunks. I had about that many people on it, about 25 or so. At that point, it was feeling like a really big team, Working on The Sims 2 right now. I can't actually get an accurate estimate of how many people are working on the project. We've kind of gotten to that point. But I've decided to carry this out into the future. And I'm pretty convinced now that by the year 2050, it's going to take about 2.5 million people to make a game. And about 50,000 of those will be designers, I think. The average budget will be about $500 billion. So I think it's kind of important that we learn to work in design teams, in larger team structures. As a lead designer, I feel, more and more I'm kind of like a traffic cop. I try to encourage everybody on my, team to become a designer and, give design input. And so the lead designer is really more in the role of gating and filtering and deciding which ideas come together and kind of organizing this flow of design ideas that are flowing around you. One thing that helps a lot is if you can come up with kind of high-level design goals that you then kind of program your team with, And what you want them to do is you want them to start thinking like you. If you can give them not just a decision, I want you to do, use the red button, but give them a, pretty clear reason why, what is the reasoning behind each of your design decisions, pretty soon they'll get to the point where they can, basically predict what you're going to say. And you've succeeded, when they come up and they ask you, do you want the red button or the blue button? And you say, I want the red button. And they say, oh, I thought you were going to say that, so I did it with the red button. At that point, you've been successful. You've managed to distribute some of your kind of high-level thinking through the team. A lot of times in a design team, you want it to split up, kind of go different directions. And that's handy when what's handy there is that you give them a high-level kind of direction for the design, almost a prime directive. No matter what you do in the design, make sure it's user-friendly, or make sure the explosions are really big, or maximum gore, or whatever it is. But you should have kind of a broad design goals that your other design team members can use, to help them make decisions. But also, you can use yourself as a compass. When you feel like you're lost on a problem, you can always kind of refer back to that. Oh yeah, giant explosions. Okay, and that might help kind of set you off in the right direction down the design tree. A lot of times, you want your team to come together on some cadence, on the same problem, pulling in the same direction. Usually, you want to do that maybe on a weekly basis. On large problems, they come together and help you solve, the really big problems, the central problems of the game. Sometimes you just want to come together on some schedule and share the problems that you're individually dealing with. How many of you are using Wiki in your design process? Okay, well, I'm not going to say anything more than you really should be, because it turns out to be just an incredibly useful collaboration tool between designers. One thing you want to do when you're working in a larger design team is you want to figure out what the different members are good at. Figure out what your team's superpowers are. I can't overemphasize this. Each designer is different. Each one has a different approach. And it'll take a while to, with the designer especially, to figure out what, problems they're very good at solving and how you integrate that into the superpowers of the rest of your team. This is Chris Trotier. She's a designer I've been working with for about 5 years, very closely, kind of as co-designer. And Chris and I have discovered that we each have, very different talents. And over the years, we've gotten to the point where we've managed to leverage those talents and make them work together. One thing that kind of my superpower is in generating lots of stupid and crazy ideas. And so when we're working on a design problem, I'll sit there and throw out a billion, weird solutions. Then together, we'll sit there and look at all these solutions and very quickly kind of filter through them and figure out which ones make sense, which ones don't. Then the remaining ones, we'll reorganize them. And we do this kind of together. We both kind of have equal ability at that. At this point, Chris's superpower kind of comes into play. And it turns out Chris is an incredibly efficient compression algorithm. She can take whatever we've decided and compress it into an incredibly, readable design document. And not only is she a really efficient compression algorithm, but she's decompressible on a variety of different platforms. So this document can be read by managers, programmers, artists. It's really these are like 3-page documents. Just incredibly succinct. But it's amazing how valuable that skill is. When you're working in a design team. Finding the most compressed description of your game is something that you should always be looking for. And this is kind of the idea of the elevator pitch. But it happens at different levels. There's like the elevator pitch. There's the 1-page document, the 5-page document. All these things are kind of important. It's something that you'll never get the most compressed description, but you always want to be striving for it. Another game that Chris and I play, we call the sticky note game. This is something we use for setting priorities during development, milestone development and stuff. Chris is very good at looking at a design that we're working on and cutting it up into little bite-sized chunks, and even figuring out kind of which programmers would be best to do which chunks. She puts these on sticky notes is the way we play the game, and then on the whiteboard, we actually draw out milestones, and we roughly together group these little sticky notes into different milestones. Then what I do is I go through and I assign design priorities to them. I really think we should do this one first, then that one, then that one, and then we'll have visibility into the next milestone. Once we have these, kind of roughly laid out, we go back to the engineers and we get an engineering estimate. How many weeks to do each of these features? And once we've got that, then we say, oh, shit, 7 weeks to do that. In that case, we're going to push that down. And then we reorganize these things on the list. And that way, we usually end up with a pretty efficient development process that's taking into account input from the engineers, the designers, et cetera. Another thing we found is that Chris and I have very different design sensibilities. I'm kind of Mr. Science, Mr. Techno Geek. Chris is much more warm and fuzzy, touchy-feely, which kind of brings us into conflict a lot, in stylistic terms. And we actually maintain this kind of dynamic tension on purpose, and we found it to be extremely useful, very valuable, to have two people pulling at both ends, representing both, kind of classes of players. Frequently, when Chris is not in a design meeting, and I'm surrounded by the techno geeks, I actually pick up her flag and I start being warm and fuzzy, just to kind of maintain that tension. Having a totally different mindset on a problem, especially from somebody who's a more casual gamer or somebody who's very outside of our normal demographic, can have just really amazing impacts on the design. I think we found that with The Sims. So many women working on The Sims. Let me show you a little riddle here. Okay, what's the correct answer to this riddle? Well, the correct answer is soccer plus mom equals SUV. That's true now. About 20 years ago, the correct answer was Volvo station wagon, which I don't really care about, but it turns out Volvo does. They're losing a lot of people in what used to be their core demographic, which were mothers. And so they actually started an interesting project recently. They decided to assemble an entire team of women designers to design a car for them. And they just kind of said, go design a car for us. We want to see what you do. It's kind of an experimental project. What they ended up with this, call it the Volvo YCC, your concept car. One of the first things you notice is it's got kind of wraparound bumpers that go almost all around the entire thing here. You might notice in the picture, too, that there's no real hood. There's a front of the car, but it doesn't open. There's no user-serviceable engine parts. And in fact, they have these little things on the outside. You can kind of see them on the back fender over here. And that's how you fill it with fuel and washer fluid and stuff. And these are kind of interesting. You just actually push the nozzle into there. There's no gas cap to lose. The thing just folds out of the way. This is actually race car technology that they adapted, for usability. So they thought a lot about ease of use and just kind of the typical things that annoy you about a car. The interior had very interesting ergonomics, had a huge, massive storage space in the center console, room for a large purse, a lot of drink holders and whatnot. The back was, very reconfigurable for storage. It had some interesting little details. You might notice the headrests here have this slot. It turns out that women with pigtails, when they're driving around, their head is always pushed forward from the headrest, And it's something a man would just never occur to a man. But a very simple redesign, really impacted that. Now, another thing they did is that they made the seat liners replaceable, which might at first seem like just kind of a customization aesthetic thing. But if you imagine the winters and summers in Sweden and how it varies, actually being able to put different materials on the seat actually was a pretty interesting functional decision. It's pretty useful. Now, not to be outdone, the Japanese tried a project recently. It was actually a joint venture between Sony and Toyota. And this is great. They decided, and I don't know who made this decision, but they wanted to see what would happen if they mixed Aibo with the Toyota sedan. And the result was this curious thing. It's called the Toyota Pod. And one of the most apparent things about this car is that it has externally visible emotional states. When you first come to it in the morning, it lights up orange because it's happy. If you neglect it or don't bring it in for service, it gets very sad. If you drive it around just real erratically, it actually gets mad. And what's interesting is it's displaying that it's mad to every other driver out there, which actually I think is a very interesting design decision. I mean, that could save a lot of accidents. The antenna of this thing is its tail. It wags its tail when you unlock it because it's happy to see you. The interior was really wacky. It has these funny seats. This is like the driving position. When you open the door, all the seats turn to face outward. It's easy to get in and out. And now if you're sitting there with the doors closed and you don't put the key in the ignition, all the seats turn to face each other. And now you have a little living room where you can sit there and have conversations, and little tables, and you have little drinks on it and stuff. This is, it's a weird car, but it actually has a lot of innovative ideas. And I think one thing as a kind of general designer you always want to be doing is looking for innovative ideas and learning from them. These are the cheapest prototypes you will ever find, is learning from other people's kind of attempts. One thing I do when I'm working on a game problem is I go out and look at the games on the shelf, or even download a lot of shareware games and get a sense of how other people have solved the problem. That is a far cheaper prototype than anything you're ever going to build. Okay, so kind of to get into the actual topic of my talk, you're making good progress in your design. You're zipping through that design tree and everything's going well, and then all of a sudden, bang, you're stuck. What do you do? What kind of approaches can you apply to that? First thing that's actually kind of one of the most important things is kind of acknowledging the fact that you're stuck. Usually you're stuck because either you took a wrong turn somewhere else down the road, or maybe you're in just really rough territory and you need to go slowly and be very considerate and careful about the design decisions you make from this point on. You really want to take your time now when you're stuck. You don't want to rush through and grab the first solution that offers itself. There's kind of this general model of creativity and problem solving that is a two-step process. Step one is the generation of a large number of possible solutions. And then step two is basically applying a filter to all the solutions, very effectively kind of figuring out which of those solutions are viable at a given point in time. There's a different way of looking at it, and this is a little bit closer, I think, to my sensibilities, is that when I'm encountering a design problem, I try to look at it from different directions with a lot of the methods that I'm talking about here today. And I'll just keep trying totally different approaches, looking at the thing from totally different angles. If that doesn't work, then I start stepping away from it to higher and higher levels, or further down the design, or back up the design tree, and try spinning that around, looking at that from different directions. And usually at some point, and sometimes it's intuitive, but at some point something gives. There's some, all of a sudden apparent solution. There's something kind of opens up ahead of you, and you say, okay, that makes sense. And this is kind of the process of applying a lot of these different kind of filters and methods to the design problem from different directions. As you're going down the design tree and you get stuck, one thing, this is actually very simple, that's helped a lot, is that when you're designing something, always be designing like 4 things at once. Have 4 different design paths active at any time. When you get stuck on one, you just go to another one. Park it for a while, because a lot of times you'll make progress by not thinking about it. When you get stuck on that one, jump to another one. Having several of these active, at some point, as you start making progress down the other branches, you'll just go back and find out that this hard, intractable problem that you had before, suddenly it's cleared up, usually because of some design decision you made on one of these other parallel branches. So this, to me, is kind of what a lot of game design feels like. Another thing I do when I'm stuck is I free associate on the web. I mean, the web is a great tool for this. You can kind of figure out a succinct way to represent some aspect of your problem, type it into a browser, and look at what comes up. And you're going to come up with a lot of weird web pages. They're going to send you off in all sorts of kind of different associative paths. But it's surprising how often just reading about random research papers that are tangentially related to your problem will spark some idea that will help kind of clear it up in your mind. There's always the call in the reinforcements mode, which is if you're working on a design team, bring in other designers and get other heads on the problem, get different approaches. That's kind of a more obvious one. One thing that we always have to remind ourselves of when we're working on a game is that the whiteboard is not the game. When we're working on designs, we're frequently in this kind of abstract space with, bubble diagrams and lines and graphs. And it's so easy to forget the fact that that's not the game. And the player is not even thinking of the game in these terms. The screen isn't the game either, really. A lot of times you'll be kind of mocking stuff on the screen and seeing problems. But really the game is in the player's head. And these problems that you're facing really should be about what is the player thinking about, what are they noticing, what are they trying to do, what are the things that are passing through their perceptual filters. And a lot of times for the player, they don't have the right information at the right time. Even though it's sitting there on the screen in front of them, it wasn't getting through their perceptual filters. And so their mind space is stuck on a problem that when you look at the screen, you think, oh, of course, they should be able to figure that out because the answer's right there. But they're not seeing it. So that's why it's important to eventually think about these design problems in terms of the cognitive space of the player's mind. When you're stuck, a lot of times, if you had landmarks in your game design, it helps to kind of recall those. If you kind of remember that, oh yeah, Technicolor explosions, yes, okay, then A is the right branch. That is frequently very useful. One thing that I always like to think about is the idea of, if I were to take my game and turn it into a board game, what would it look like? And this is kind of one level of abstraction back from your game design. This is actually a game that was designed by a close friend and colleague of mine, who I think is here today, the designer of ToeJam and Earl, Greg Johnson, decided to design a game, the board game of ToeJam and Earl. Except for some reason, which is still kind of unclear to me, he gave it a different title. The actual title of this game is Feed the Baby of Love Mini Beans or Perish in the Flames of Hell. Maybe Greg can explain that later. And Greg likes to start describing this game by, oh, it's incredibly simple. You'll love it. It's so simple. And you start playing the game, and it's like, oh yeah, you pick a red card on Tuesday, unless the dice are over here, and da-da-da, and it starts sounding like Fizbin or Calvin Ball. And that's really half the charm of it. A quick census of this game shows that it includes a board, a set of playing pieces, a set of scorecards for each player, a spinner, 5 different card decks, 2 sets of dice, and a bag of beans, which are the currency in the game. But it's, I think, really interesting just to kind of think in terms of this massively complex thing you're doing on a computer. How would you translate that, back into real space with paper and dice and whatnot? A lot of times, when we're trying to get to a solution, we make more progress by deciding what's not the solution. We do this in a lot of meetings. We kind of say, maybe this is the solution. Nope, that's not it. Maybe that's it. Nope. And this might be, an hour of work that you spend kind of, cordoning off these areas, working them through and deciding that that's not a viable solution. But this is still progress. Basically, what you're doing is you're surrounding the solution. You're kind of trapping it in a corner. And it's important not to lose that progress. So even though you sit and have a discussion about how do we solve this problem, you have to kind of retain the knowledge of the ground you've already gone down. In some sense, it's almost like kind of ratcheting. You want to make sure that you're not losing progress through this exploration, that you're remembering which things didn't work. This is kind of like Thomas Edison and the light bulb looking for the filament. And just taking a break between these ratcheting kind of episodes helps a lot too. You can always come back with kind of a little bit different perspective. The idea of row shows is actually turned out for me to be interesting in a lot of ways, to kind of figure out are you setting the right priorities? A lot of times it turns out that you're maximizing the wrong ratio when you're working on a design. It seems pretty apparent that we should be getting the most, X for Y. But if you kind of stand back and look at it, sometimes you're really picking the wrong X and Y there. There was this race you may have heard of, the DARPA Grand Challenge, that happened a couple weeks ago. These are basically robotic cars that were going to race from Barstow to Las Vegas. No user intervention. It was interesting. They had all these entries. I was on one of the teams. One of my friends kind of had an entry into this. Almost all the entries looked kind of like this. They were these big off-road truck things with massive sensor pods on them, laser, radar, visual systems, whatnot. My friend's entry was a little bit different. It was a motorcycle. He basically took this problem that was impossibly hard and made it twice as hard. So, at first glance, this would kind of seem to be the wrong approach to solving this problem. But this thing was very interesting to watch. Now, if I can get this video to play here real quick. Let me do a quick little mode switch. There we go. Get my cursor back. There we go. Now this thing is driving itself. It's kind of looking for obstacles. It's not driving great, but it's amazing that it drives at all, And we had some issues with, it wanted to interact with traffic, but luckily nobody was hurt during this test. This is just like a field enrichment. When this thing starts coming at you, you have a high incentive to move.
Hey, watch out.
We're pretty good at reverse engineering the way human drivers think, but trying to reverse engineer the way a robot driver is thinking is a challenge. Let me get back to my tool. So now the interesting result of this, and why I wanted to show you that, is that when he brought this thing out there, he got an incredible amount of press attention because all the other ones, looked like these big car things with boxes on them, but his was this incredibly dramatic, out of control, what the hell is that type of thing, So the other people that were competing in this, were basically decided that they, wanted to maximize the most race success they could get for a given cost. They were trying to build the most competitive vehicle they could for this race. Whereas Anthony actually took a totally different approach. The ratio he was trying to maximize was how do I get the most press attention for the least amount of cost. His was probably the cheapest entry there, and it easily got the most press exposure. The other entrants were kind of assuming that race success would equal press attention, but that was not the case. Now, since nobody came even close to winning this race, probably it'll be 5, maybe 10 years before actually somebody wins the race, and they're going to keep doing it, it becomes more of a strategic long-range funding battle. How do you get sponsors? So this turned out to be the right ratio to maximize in this given problem. We're used to financial people dealing with ratios all the time. And a lot of times just, very simple little metrics I apply kind of in game development. I always try to look at, how are we converting our development effort into player enjoyment? Is what we're working on right now, if we spend a week on this feature, is that going to give us more player enjoyment in the end than working on that feature? Sometimes this is just an extraordinarily hard balance to strike. There was a game we did many years ago called Sim Life by a really bright guy, King Karakotzias. He was very into biology and genetics and all that. He spent like a month doing this beautiful genetics model, the way the creatures would evolve and do sexual crossover and mutation and whatnot. He actually captured a lot of the real kind of strange little things that happen in real biology. At the very end, we decided that we needed to have like some sound effect, so you would know when two creatures were mating. And so he just found this little wave file, and they go, ooh la la, when they mate. What's interesting is like years later, you talk to people about this game, and the very first thing, nobody ever mentions how elaborate the genetic model was or the fidelity of it or how cool those screens were, showing the genetic crossover. They all say, oh, I love the ooh la la, This is like, 5 minutes of effort compared to 1 month of effort. Okay, so it's pretty obvious here, which one converted the developer's effort into player enjoyment the most. And sometimes it's a dramatic difference like that, orders of magnitude. Another kind of thing that this is a good example of is a lot of times when you hit a hard design problem, you want to fall back to humor. We found this frequently that if we're totally stuck, think of the most humorous way to spin our design problem, and it's amazing how often that becomes a huge benefit. In The Sims, we had this horrible problem of how do we have them change clothes? Do they take off their clothes, find a dresser? Where's the laundry going to go? We spent weeks working on this problem until we finally just kind of gave up and said, oh, the hell with it. We're going to have them jump up in the air and magically change clothes. And we did that, and it was just charming. The players loved it. It became kind of an iconographic moment for the game. We had a similar problem in The Sims where frequently they have to interact with these little objects that kind of have to be parts of the animations. And where do they get them from? Is there central storage? Do we track them? Is there kind of an inventory of these things? And we finally gave up and kind of said that, okay, they just always pull their hand behind their back and pull out whatever it is, a cup or flowers or plate. And so that kind of led to one of the central rules of the Sims universe is that anything that they need that they don't have, they pull from their butt. And this is just kind of, again, the humorous kind of solution to that turned out to be actually a benefit. Another way of looking at ratios, this is very simple, easy technique, is to look at frequency analysis. You can do this with interfaces, with features, with anything. You can observe players using your interface, and it's not too hard to do this analysis and figure out what percentage of the time are they pressing each of these buttons. And you get a very quick sense of which buttons are being used the most and which the least. This is very useful for setting priorities, because if you were spending half your time working on this thing over here, and then you do the frequency analysis and find out the player is only hitting it 2% of the time, but you've totally dropped the ball on this guy up here or this 20% down there, then you're not maximizing your development time to player enjoyment. You can do this not only with interface, but also with game features. You can look at any game and kind of say what percentage of the time is the player spending really kind of working in that feature. And it's amazing how useful this is for setting your priorities and making sure that you're solving the right problem, the problem that the player is, in fact, most often going to face. Oh, okay. This is the part of the talk I know you've all been waiting for. So, people always come and ask me to talk about game design. Everywhere I go, talk about game design, talk about game design. I never get to talk about the things I want to talk about. So, I've decided I'm just going to start talking about those things inside of my game design talks. So, and if there's a connection, there's a connection. If not, there's not, So I've become kind of a big historical fan of the Russian space program recently. Started filling my house with Russian space artifacts, much to my wife's dismay. Okay, 1962. This is a state-of-the-art, American Mercury capsule and its associated interface. This is kind of the Russian equivalent of Vostok from the same period with its interface. You'll notice that the Mercury is maybe twice as complex as the Vostok. Okay, 66, state-of-the-art American Gemini capsule and its associated interface. Russian Soyuz and its interface. At this point, you kind of see that the Gemini is, maybe 3 times more complex than the Soyuz. 1970, state-of-the-art American Apollo spacecraft and its interface. The Soyuz hasn't changed a bit. Okay, at this point, the American interface is looking pretty big compared to the Soviet one. 1980, American space shuttle. Soyuz still hasn't changed a bit. 1990, they decided to redesign this space shuttle instrument panel. It wasn't complex enough. So, and the Russians actually redesigned their Soyuz one a little bit. It's kind of important to realize how small this is compared to the space shuttle one. It would fit into a space about that large. One thing that's kind of curious about the Russian panel here is this little thing. It's called the Globus. It actually is identical almost to the very original Vostok, the same instrument. This is their primary navigation instrument that they use for figuring out where they are in space. This is a close-up of it. What it is a mechanical computer. You basically spin orbits into these knobs here, and there are these little gears inside that turn the globe, according to the orbital parameters, and there's a little crosshair showing where you are. You are here. This is what they use to fire their retro rockets. And the thing about this, it's about this big. It's just an amazing device. I've kind of taken it apart, to reverse engineer it. But the thing about it is it's pretty much never failed. So the Russians never replaced it. And it's from the American point of view, it's almost repulsive. Oh my God, they're still using mechanical computers. But and people have this kind of misconception about the Russian space program. But if you actually kind of look at how many cosmonauts they've lost in their spacecraft. They've had a couple of big ground accidents with ground personnel. But if you look at how many cosmonauts were lost inside the spacecraft, they've only lost 4 in the entire history of their program, which is about a quarter of what the Americans have lost in theirs. And which is, most people don't kind of realize, how robust these Russian systems have become. In fact, to this day, the only way to get a NASA astronaut into space on the space station is on a Russian spacecraft, and probably will be for at least another year. So it's not surprising that when the Chinese decided to build a manned spacecraft, the Shenzhou, that they decided to copy the Russians. And it never once occurred to them to copy the Americans, the American approach. So that concludes the Russian Space Minute. Thank you. So now we get down to what to do if you're really, really stuck. One thing that helps a lot is using different materials. You may have heard of the idea of learning styles. Different people kind of approach different problems almost with different sensory strategies. Some people are more visual thinkers. They like drawing pictures and diagrams. Some people are more auditory. They really helps them to explain it, verbalize, have discussions about the problem. Some people are better actually, working with reading and writing documents and working it out on paper. And a lot of people, I find that I'm much better kinesthetically, and so I like to have all little things I'm always manipulating, little toys and whatnot. We do a lot of prototypes in all different materials. This is actually a drawing that Chris did of something that we're working on. So we do prototypes in a lot of materials, off the computer, on paper, with blocks, with clay. Sometimes these have really useful side effects. So Chris does these kind of funny little drawings, which turn out to be a great way to motivate our artists. She'll put these up on the wiki page, and then the first thing the artists say is, "Ooh, can I redraw that for you?" But these prototypes, the way I think of them really, is they're scaffolding. I might kind of prototype a design problem, let's say with Legos or whatever. But what I'm really doing is with my imagination, I'm putting layers on top of that and imagining the real solution. So the prototypes for me are just kind of a minor structure that I can then put the imaginary solution on top of. It helps kind of extend my imagination. It makes my imagination more leveraged, more powerful when I'm trying to envision different design solutions. Robert Louis Stevenson, when he wrote Treasure Island, it was kind of a curious approach. Before he wrote the book, the first thing he did was he drew a map of Treasure Island. And then he took that map and he just sat there and kind of stared at it for hours and hours and hours. And started imagining all the different things that could happen on this map. And over time, the story emerged from that. So basically, this map that he drew became the scaffolding for his imagination. And his imagination drew out the story of Treasure Island, from this graphic. There's a group in Palo Alto, a design lab called IDEO. And they have this cool thing called the Tech Box. How many of you have heard of this? It's what it is all the designers that work there, and they do a lot of industrial design stuff, they collect weird, interesting, unusual things. Sometimes it's materials or mechanisms, really counterintuitive little things. Sometimes it's chemicals. And they organize it in this little box. And when somebody submits something into the box, they write up a little description of why it's cool. And a lot of times when they're working on a design problem, they'll just kind of randomly open the box and pull things out at random and start playing with them. They have kind of sections of the box. Some are kind of more about electronics or thermodynamics or mechanical linkages. So they can kind of roughly sort them in that sense. But really what these things do, they spark your imagination, sometimes just with the interaction of playing with these odd, unusual little things, but also sometimes there are very specific solutions. Oh, I didn't know a material could do that. Or I didn't know they had aluminum foam. Or I didn't know they had superconducting, metal tubing, or whatever it was. But that's what this box is full of. If you're more interested in this is actually a pretty good book describing how they work in their process called The Art of Innovation. Watson and Crick, when they were working on the DNA problem, they basically cracked the problem by building these kind of elaborate hand-built models of molecular bonds and playing with them over time. And they finally got this one structure that actually not only could they get the bonds to fit correctly, but when they stood back and they saw the double helix, it was so aesthetically beautiful to them that they said it had to be right. I mean, a lot of it was just they were able to stand back and look at this thing, rather than kind of looking at it on a piece of paper as chemical equations. Seeing the three-dimensional form of this in a model convinced them that they were on the right track. When I do a game, one of the things I always do is I try to build models, outside the game, that help me come to understand the game. When I did The Sims, we have this neighborhood screen at the top of The Sims. One of the things I did early in the project was actually to build this neighborhood out of model railroad stuff. And it was interesting just because it helped me think about the level of abstraction. I was able to kind of consider this model and consider, what are the type of things I would want to do? What's the progression through this? What does the world feel like? How do I make the world feel kind of a little bit more toy-like? When I did SimAnt, one of the things I did is this is like a big 2-foot model of an ant that I built. It's still hanging on my wall. But in building it, as a kid, this is what I used to spend half my time doing, is building models. So for me, in particular, I think the idea of building a model, my mind just kind of goes off into this almost Zen-like state because there's so much tedium involved in building something like this. But at the same time, I think you're kind of processing aspects, and you're getting a deeper awareness than you would get just by reading a book or looking at a picture. Something we got in our office recently that's actually turned out to be pretty useful and interesting is one of these 3D printers. You've probably seen these before. But we're able to use these to print out 3D models. And sometimes the artists just kind of play with it and make weird models that we print out. Other times we take like the Sims characters from the Sims 2 game and print them out, and we paint them. And we kind of play with them as toys. Again, it gives you a very different perspective when you're dealing in your hands with atoms instead of bits on a computer screen. Your mind just kind of spins into totally different possibilities for solving a problem. Now, if you're still really, really stuck, and this might sound silly, but in fact, I'm quite serious about it. Ask the receptionist. And the key to this isn't that the receptionist is this huge reservoir of design knowledge, but rather that you find that if you have to describe this gnarly design problem to somebody else who is totally unfamiliar with it, from square one, that it forces you to communicate it into a different language. You and the designers were thinking about it in this very technical design language. If you have to go to somebody who is totally not fluent in that language and describe the problem to them, it's surprising how often solutions will all of a sudden click or become apparent as you're trying to explain this to the receptionist or your mother or my sister or whatever. It's that thing where basically it's to learn. The most effective way to learn is to teach. And so I think this really helps clarify, put you into a different language space than you were working in entirely. And a lot of times that helps. So let's say you have a solution now. You think you've got a solution to your problem that you've been working on for a while. How can we now measure that solution? How can we kind of evaluate? What kind of metrics can we apply to that solution? A couple things to realize at the beginning. First of all, that there are an infinite number of solutions to any design problem. What's the chance that you pick the right one? There isn't always a perfect solution. There, basically, is never a perfect solution to any design problem. Design is basically the art of compromises, and any design solution is a set of compromises. So don't expect that you've got the perfect answer, because it'll never be perfect. You might get 98% perfect, 95% perfect. And probably the most depressing thing to realize is that your wonderful new design solution is destined eventually to become a part of another design problem down the road. And so if you can look a little bit further down from every solution and say, what are the repercussions of this further down the design tree, sometimes they're not worth their benefit. The cost of the solution is too high compared to what the problem it's solving in the here and now. If it's a really hard problem that you've been working on in a hard time, one thing that we found that we want to throw the solution away and then try to come up with a different solution and see if we come up with the same one twice. And then 3 times. So if it's a really hard problem, and we've acknowledged that this is a huge problem in our design, we'll try to independently make that same decision 3 times in a row. If we come up with the same solution 3 times in a row, then we have very high confidence that it's the right solution. One thing that always concerns me about certain solutions, I'm always kind of critiquing them against, is the idea that they're not invading the top layer of the game. I think of games as kind of having very obvious dynamics that the user gets very familiar with early on in the game. It's like the overt gameplay. What is the overt dynamic the player is dealing with? Underneath that, we have secondary layers that are more elaborations. These are like little kind of more parameters, a little bit deeper analysis, deeper strategy. But the player should definitely be able to play the game with just this knowledge of this top layer. And then it keeps going down and down. But we want to make sure that our solutions are not invading the top layer. Maybe we're trying to solve a solution in the secondary layer of the game, and it gets so onerous and big and clunky that it actually comes up and starts impacting the simplicity of the top layer of gameplay. This is what Chauncey Gardner has to say about that. And also, it's kind of important, more and more for us to realize that this is the typical store that we're selling our games in. And this is our typical player. So because a solution seems like a clean, clear solution to us, we always have to kind of fall back and say, okay, would our typical customer go into Walmart one day and spend just half an hour walking around, looking to the people, listening to what they talk about, and get a sense, would they understand that the red button was the right button to press? When you're sitting in a room with a lot of really smart people that all love games, what seems simple and obvious is very different than when you're standing in Walmart listening to people compare detergent, Kind of one way to look at that is can the average player, when presented with a black box, figure out how it works? Because designers, we have an internal view of the system. We know how it's all wired up, and because we wired it up, the outside of the box, seems much more apparent to us than somebody else. A lot of times I'll actually call my sister up and I'll describe something just from the top level, saying, what if you had this, that, and the other? Which one would you press, or what would you do? And try to basically get that black box experience. With somebody on the outside of that black box, would they know that the green button is the first one to press? Or in a given situation, the yellow button should be pressed at some frequency. Usually it's not the case. And this is where playtesting is absolutely essential. It's amazing how often, the best way to really get design insight into these type of issues is do a lot of playtesting, where you bring people in who've never seen your game, they put them in front of it, you don't tell them a thing, and say, figure it out. And they get so frustrated so early, with things that you thought were so bloody obvious. And you, as a designer, get extremely frustrated. You want to say, press the red button, and they just don't do it. And that's the best way to really get clarity in the designer's mind that we screwed up. And at some point, it's a very painful process to go through, having to sit back there and restrain what you want to, tell them the answer, and expecting them to guess it correctly. Kind of another test that we apply in a lot of our games and the solutions is kind of, can somebody like standing over another person's shoulder watch them play the game? At what point do they want to grab the mouse? We get that a lot with our prototypes. Somebody will be playing with a prototype and I'll say, ooh, I want to try. At that point, I was able to actually understand the gameplay just by watching somebody else do it. I was able to learn the language of the game. I was able to infer kind of what the goal was, what my level of control was, and I've seen the person sitting down there with the mouse fail, and at that point I even think I know how not to fail. So if you can communicate that much of the game just through watching another player play it, that's a great place to be in it. It's a kind of a milestone almost for a lot of games and prototypes that we make, when somebody else wants to grab the mouse and try it. Another one that's a little bit deeper in the process is, at what point do people start complaining that there's no load save? That implies a lot of things. It implies that they feel like they've made meaningful progress. It implies that they actually feel like they've done something unique that they want to save. And for a lot of the games that we work on, at the point that I want to save, it feels like a really big event. I've finally gotten to the point where I've done something cool enough in this game to where I want to pick up and keep going tomorrow. It kind of implies a longer play arc now. Now, instead of a 5-minute toy, it's something I'm going to play all week long in one data set or one game. Another thing that we look at for solutions, sometimes the solutions don't have to be apparent, but would the player eventually trip over them? This is useful for things like tool tips, things that are not crucial to the player to know to play the game, but it would be nice if they could eventually learn this. And so rather than give them a long-winded tutorial about here's how you do that, here's how you do this, we try to make the game so that they can very quickly, in a couple of minutes, learn how to play on their own. But as they're playing, they will trip over other aspects of the game. And at that point, they might decide that what they tripped over was useful and interesting, or they might just ignore it. And then maybe trip over it later. And at that point, then they really do want to know how to bring up the help system or whatever. But just kind of allowing them to kind of brush across these things casually as they play is generally much better than forcing them through like a linear tutorial at the beginning. This is my niece, and she builds sim houses all the time. She builds these elaborate houses, and then she'll come and get all the grown-ups and say, come look at this thing I built. It's amazing, and then we'll sit there and ooh and ah over it. A friend of mine, Jim Macrae, actually brought up this thing many years ago. He said that when he was first playing SimCity, after about 10 hours, he kind of gotten the hang of the algorithms and was starting to do stuff, and then he stepped back from the game and he said, oh wow, this is what I'm good at. I should have been a city planner. Basically, the game kind of tricked him into thinking that he was really good at this thing. So this is actually a thing that I found very useful in long term, is that, how can we design a game so that when a player plays it, they feel like they've done some amazing thing that probably no other players don't, of course. Nobody else is good, could build a city like I can. They feel like their efforts not only are rewarded but appreciated within the game. And that's the point also at which they want to take stuff they've done in the game and start sharing it back out in the real world. And that's also a very important part in any game development process. When players start saying, oh, you've got to come see this thing I made in the game, that is actually showing that the game is reinforcing their positive self-esteem. This is a mime. To be more specific, this is a serial mime that was at one of our parties that we hosted for the players who go around kind of pretending to kill people. Turns out that there's a word for the fear of mimes. And I've seen the discussion groups on this. The fear of mimes is called panophobia. Okay. It's good to observe your players all the time. You kind of have to become almost a student of this. Looking at them in different situations, playing different games, not just what they're doing at the game, but what they're doing between themselves, turns out to be a crucial skill, that can help you not only design a game, but also kind of evaluate a solution to a design problem. An idea that actually was sent to me by Isaac Berry, which turned out to be very useful, I really like this idea, is that just observe the body motion of the players. Are they leaning in? Are they leaning back? How engaged are they on the edge of their seat? Are they tapping their foot? You can kind of get a sense of which parts of their brain are engaged at different parts of the game. When are they wandering? When are they super immersed? When are they laughing with another person and it becomes more of a metagame between the two real players as opposed to between our characters in the game? This is just a very simple kind of observational technique that I think we can learn a lot from. So in a sense, I think what we want to become as designers are kind of field anthropologists, and not just, again, within games, but in everyday life. We need to kind of learn to observe people and figure out what motivates them, what attracts them, what compels them. One of the things I've started doing on the side is this little group in Berkeley. Some friends and I got together. We started this thing called the Stupid Fun Club. It's a little shop where we build various robot things and whatnot. Almost everything we do involves robots, and usually some element of danger or out of controlness. One of the things we did was a project for NBC that I want to show you right now. What we did is we built robots for very specific purposes that we brought out into the public. And we basically were kind of faking AI in these things so that people were presented with the idea that there's a robot doing something that is totally autonomous. One of the first experiments we did is we went to a restaurant, and when people came into the restaurant, we said, "Oh, there's this university program, and they're building this robot waiter. And do you want to sit in that section or the real person, the real waiter section?" And when they went back there, we had this robot serving tables, taking orders, and all this stuff that we were actually kind of hidden controlling it. It was conversing on its own, but we were driving it, so we didn't hurt anybody. But they were fully convinced that it was autonomous. I want to show you kind of just, this is a short clip. Excuse the quality of the video, but it'll give you some sense of how this went.
Hello, my name is Slats. Please tell me your order now.
A grilled crab sandwich.
2 eggs over easy.
I'd like to have the ultimate burger.
Pork sandwich in brown sauce.
Brown sauce. I understand. I'll be right back.
These are filmed like as interstitials, so they come in like 2 30-second parts. That was part 1.
This is your order.
Yes, this is my order.
Here is your ketchup.
That's a food.
Please rate my performance on a scale of 1 to 10. I am hoping for a 10.
There's no soup in the bowl.
What do I have to do to get 10?
You're still too close.
Will this affect my evaluation?
I'm afraid so.
4.5.
3.
Okay, I'll give you a 10.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
I don't think waitresses have anything to worry about.
So one of the things that was interesting about that was, in the first 2 minutes, they were kind of like, "Wow, robot waiter, that's amazing. How about that?" And within 2 minutes, they were totally normal with it. And they were talking to other people about, their dinner plans or their kids or whatever. It took them 2 minutes to kind of get over the future shock of a robot waiter, and then it was like perfectly normal to them. Of course we have robot waiters, And it just struck me how quick, one of our concepts for this was we wanted to kind of pop ahead like 10 or 20 years in the future and get a sense of, how are people going to relate to these machines? If we kind of pop ahead now into that future, and are they going to relate to them as pets or machines or what? Whoop, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to replay that. Let me do this. There we go. And it's kind of interesting how they chose to parse these things, And they treated these robots pretty much as an appliance, somewhere between an appliance and a waiter. They gave it certain kind of polite affordances that they would give a person, but actually the way they spoke to it was, they spoke to it like a computer. But it was just remarkable to me that they were not more surprised by this, and they didn't know they were being filmed. We had all the cameras hidden and everything here. The second one I'm going to show you here is one where we built a robot and we kind of beat it up. It was kind of smashed like it had been hit by a car. Then we put it on a side street near downtown Oakland, kind of in a junk pile, and it was begging for help. as people walk by. Okay. And it was kind of a good Samaritan test, to see who would stop. And if they did stop, it actually kind of ran them through this whole troubleshooting, please press the red button, like we had a little Fisher-Price, activity panel on it. So I'll show you that one next.
Help me. I require human assistance. Will you please help me? Can you hear me? Help. Excuse me. Excuse me. I have fallen over. There has been an accident.
What's the matter?
I require human assistance.
That's the first half.
Can you describe the damage?
No, I can't really describe the damage. I
I
just see.
need Professor Johnson.
You need Professor Johnson? What's the phone number?
555-0121. I'm scared.
You scared? We scared of
I
you.
can't get up.
You can't
I
get up.
can't get up.
Wait a minute. They said your call can't be complete. You sure that's the right number? We'll look you up in the yellow page.
Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome. Come on.
So just hang in there, okay?
That one actually had some very interesting gender differences. We noticed that the individual women that were walking by it almost never stopped. They would see it, and they would speed up and walk away faster. The men kind of came into two groups. There were several men in business suits that were all dressed, wearing a brief, holding a briefcase. They would walk by it in general. They would see it. It would ask for help. They would stop, put down their briefcase, immediately write the robot up, and then grab the briefcase and walk off. And you get the impression that they just walk around Oakland all day riding tipped-over robots. But the other group of men, what they would do, and these are kind of more of the guys in dungarees or jeans or whatever. They would go up, they would listen to it talk for a second, and then they would ignore it, and they would start stripping it for parts, which was driving the sound guy crazy because they were pulling his expensive wireless mics out of it, But they just kind of assumed that, something in the junk pile, it must have cool parts in it. Universally, the only people that really stopped and interacted and tried to help the robot were always mixed gender couples. And they always stopped, and they always tried to converse with it, and they actually tried to help it. And I'm not quite sure what to infer from that, but I thought it was kind of a fascinating result, how the gender mix totally changed the way that people approach this thing. But I just want to show these kind of examples of how you can always become kind of a student of human behavior. And for a game designer, that's probably the most important thing you can be doing. So now I have to stop talking, and my time is up, actually a little over. But thanks for coming. I hope you got something out of the hour.